Thanks for joining us here on 9 News Plus. I'm Chris Bianchi and joined by 9 News legal expert Whitney Traylor for a bit on a high-level look at the leaked Supreme Court preliminary decision. I'm going to read from this a little bit here that would overturn Roe v. Wade, the 1973 landmark case that made abortion legal essentially at the federal level. And the leaked draft last night, that was released, I should say, back on Monday night, showed that at least 5 of the Supreme Court's 9 justices preliminarily supported the overturning of Roe v. Wade, which again would make legal abortion no longer federally the law of the land. It would make it a state-by-state issue. So we're going to get into some high-level questions. Again, a lot of you might have questions about this, but my first question, and I'm sorry if this sounds kind of overly simplistic for a lot of you out there may know the answer to this already, but for those of you who might not know the answer to this question, first question I've got is, why is this overall such a big deal?
Right. Well, I was getting nervous that I wouldn't know how to answer that first question, but I think I can. Yeah. Right. No, I think I can answer it. It is a big deal because obviously the issue of abortion is deeply seated with folks, and the reason it's become such a legal issue is because, as you mentioned, in 1973, when the Supreme Court ruled that it was a federally protected right because a woman has a right to privacy, then it became even more politicized. And since then, states have been bringing case after case, essentially trying to overrule it. And so now that's essentially, at least in this first preliminary draft, what it appears the court is doing. So from a legal perspective, the Supreme Court is overturning its own precedent. That happens. It's happened before. It's many times, but it's not necessarily common. So that's also a big deal.
All right, so that's a big part of it, and obviously an important part of what we've also already discussed is that this is a preliminary ruling, so it is a draft, and justices have the right to change their minds after the draft. And first of all, again, if you could explain what is a draft, what are we talking about here, and what are the chances, in your view, that the justices change their minds, and perhaps does this leak increase those chances?
Well, the leak is super concerning, and I'll explain why. Because the process that the justices go through maintains the independence and the objectivity of the court. So what happens is when the justices deliberate amongst themselves, they're alone. There's no other party, so they can be free to deliberate. They argue, they try and change each other's minds. And so what happens is, after oral argument, which in this case happened in December, they took a preliminary vote, which is not unusual, and the vote was 5, according to this, 5 conservative justices to 2. So because there was a majority, what happens is then the Chief Justice assigns the case to be written by somebody. That's Justice Alito. And then what happens is they write drafts and they circulate it amongst them, and then they'll write a dissent, and they do this several times before a final draft is issued. And during those deliberations orally together in a room, and then when they get the drafts going back and forth, they can actually persuade each other. So is it possible that they change their positions? Yes. Is it possible that they change their rationale in different ways? Yes. In this case, it's probably not likely because of the nature of this and the the serious divide that I would be surprised if any of the justices change their positions, who at least already have indicated the 5 versus 2.
You mentioned this already, but the fact that this was leaked out is highly unusual, if not unprecedented. Is the unprecedented part correct as far as you know, and why is it such a big deal that this leak came out?
It's a big deal because now it feels like this is being politicized, because before the justices now even rule on their final opinion, you now have this groundswell of people. There's going to be protests on both sides, so it is dangerous. I had never heard of a preliminary draft being leaked, and the little bit of research I saw was it hasn't happened in modern day cases. So this is a problem because you remember we have these 3 branches of government, and they're supposed to be checks and balances. And if we start feeling that the judges are political and partisan, and we're seeing that more and more with the confirmation hearings, and they're getting more partisan, if that starts to happen, then judges are essentially legislators. They're just essentially going to rule in the way whoever appointed them, that type of thing. And that's actually what Justice Alito said. He said this should not be an issue for the federal court. This isn't a constitutional issue. It should be with the states where they elect their representatives. And so it will reflect what the states want to do, is the notion behind Alito's position overturning Roe of 1973.
Interesting. Supreme Court Chief Justice John Roberts issued a statement on Tuesday morning, confirming that this was indeed an accurate leak, but B, he also said that they're launching a full investigation into that leak. What would the punishment be, and how likely is it? I know this may be a little bit outside your realm. How likely is it that they figure out who leaked this and why?
Well, I would have to think they could figure that out with our computer forensics and the privacy around the Supreme Court. They should be able to. I'd be surprised if they didn't figure it out. I don't know what potential crimes, there may be. It may be, I don't know, there may be something specific to this, or it could be misuse of government property or something else. So whether they find out or not is a question, but it seems like whoever did it was trying to essentially politicize this. And, it sounds like Congress, there's been several senators and Congress folks saying we need to investigate this as well. So we may get to the bottom of it.
All right. I'm going to put you on the spot here a little bit, Whitney. Justice Samuel Alito, who you mentioned, who wrote the majority opinion, said that Roe v. Wade was, quote, egregiously wrong, end quote, to begin with, citing, he said that there were no guarantees in the Constitution for the right to an abortion. He also cited the 14th Amendment. What's your opinion on his logic? Again, I know I'm putting you on the spot a little bit here.
Well, like most of the justices in the Supreme Court opinions, they can be backed. These judges are highly intelligent, and they can essentially find reasons within the law to justify their position. And here, essentially what Justice Alito is saying is that, look, this is the activist passive type of argument. So when you hear people saying it's an activist court, that means it's a court that wants to get involved in public policy issues, whereas a pacifist court or a pacifist judge is one who only looks at issues that are purely related to the Constitution. And so Justice Alito was saying, look, abortion's not mentioned in the Constitution, and it's also not necessarily baked into who we are as a society. So he's saying Roe was based on a 14th Amendment due process argument about privacy. And what he's saying is that, look, these things are not constitutional. Therefore, the Supreme Court shouldn't be looking at them. They should be back with the states with their, and I think I have the quote, it says, the issues around abortion are to be resolved like most important questions in our democracy by citizens trying to persuade one another and then voting. And so to get back to your first question, why is it such a big deal? This is also federal government and states' rights, which goes back to the Civil War, right? And who should really be deciding these issues?
By the way, the 14th Amendment, quickly, my general understanding of it is basically equal rights for equal citizens. It came after slavery. It was enacted in 1868. It's considered one of the more important amendments out there. So, again, for those of you who might not know what the 14th Amendment is, with that in mind here, Whitney, based on what was specifically addressed in that draft opinion and Alito's interpretation of it in the conservative courts, what other implications could there be from this ruling?
Well, this is going to be significant, I think, in a lot of ways, because a number of states actually already have laws in place. Some of the states, even when Roe was enacted, they didn't abolish their abortion laws, they just didn't enforce them. So now there's a question, will those be back in place? But lots of other states enacted new laws. Some of them actually create a felony for the doctor. They can be imprisoned for up to 6 years, $100,000 fine. And because some of those say you can only perform an abortion if it's a medical emergency and the mother's life is in danger. And so now you're going to have doctors faced with the decision, is this mother's life really in danger? And if they perform the procedure and then somebody says, no, it wasn't, then that doctor is going to have to prove that that patient's life was actually in danger. And where that creates a conflict is if the doctor's nervous about getting sued under the abortion laws, if they say, no, the woman's life isn't in danger, and the woman dies, then you may have a medical malpractice claim. So you're going to have issues there, and then I think you're going to have in our political races across the country are going to be even more intense than now, because now it's up to the states to enact whether they're going to ban abortion or they're going to, permit it like we did in Colorado. And so now these races are going to even have greater implications.
With that in mind, Colorado is currently seen as a bit of a refuge. What else would need to be done to solidify that status, or potentially from the other side of things to potentially chip away?
So Colorado, in like many states, I think 26 states have laws that ban abortion on some level, either totally or on some level, if Roe is overturned. And then there's a handful of states, around 20 states, that have laws protecting the right to reproductive health and abortion rights. Colorado enacted such a law in April. The legislature passed it. Governor Polis signed it. So it's currently law. Whatever the courts do on this in Colorado, it's essentially status quo. You can still, get this reproductive right and the abortion. Now, this could be changed by another legislature. If in 2 years there's, different senators and different, they can overturn this with another statute. You could have a governor years from now who signs a different bill into place. The only way to really sort of solidify this is to get a constitutional amendment, which there have been efforts on both sides in Colorado, and it just hasn't passed. Because there you have to get 55% of the voters.
And is it the same federally?
Federally, to get an amendment is much more complicated. And so federally, they've been trying to pass different laws, though, protecting abortion. So essentially, if the court says, the court overrules Roe and says, hey, it's up to the states, then a legislative body can pass a law saying either you're permitted to have abortion in these situations or you're not in these situations. The Congress last year tried to pass a law. It got through the House, but it didn't get through the Senate. So federally, it'll be more challenging, I think, than in some states.
My final main question for you here, Whitney, is while addressing this, Samuel Alito specifically addressed cases like Obergefell versus Hodges, which legalized same-sex marriage about 10 years ago. There are a lot of discussions right now about the likelihood of a domino effect for rights like this also to be reversed by the court. How would this change the previous same-sex ruling?
Well, I don't think it will, but I think the idea is that this is the court overturning a very established precedent. So you had Roe in 1973, which was essentially affirmed by Casey in 1992, saying that, they made the distinction between viability. So they said essentially it's 23 to 24 weeks before a child is viable. And so before a fetus is viable, can live outside the womb. And therefore, before that time period, the Supreme Court in Casey said, yeah, you can legalize abortion. You can't restrict it before that time period. So now you're going to see possibly, this is the concern, more of these types of rights being chipped away at. And we just had the oral argument on the football coach praying at the 50-yard line. And that was one where the court is expected to rule in his favor, which is essentially expanding sort of religious rights, religious accommodation in public settings. So I mentioned that there is a set of cases that it looks like the court is moving in a more and more conservative direction, and this is consistent with that.
All right, well, a lot of information there to unpack. Hopefully this answered a lot of your questions about this, but 9 News legal expert Whitney Traylor, we appreciate a few minutes of your time here.
Well, it's good to be here, and I'll just say you're going to see, because folks may have other questions, you're going to see litigation. So people are going to challenge these on both sides, saying, hey, it's unconstitutional. If somebody is not permitted to get an abortion in a certain state, they'll challenge it. And so this is not over, but you're going to see it in different states going different ways. And we'll have case after case further defining what what those parameters are. So it's going to be continued to evolve. So there'll be more questions and more answers as we go forward.
And we know we'll have you for all those. Feels like there's always some sort of legal
Yes.
interest to have you on. So again, happy to have you on board. But 9 News legal expert Whitney Traylor, thank you for a bit more on the big news this week about the potential overruling of Roe v. Wade. Thanks so much.